Thank you for joining us, Shark's Perspective, the podcast with subject matter experts talking marketing. On this episode, we're going to talk about one of the most important skills in marketing there is relationships. Regardless of the widget you create and market, it ultimately comes down to knowing how to deal with other people. It's one of the most important skills you'll ever learn and continue to develop throughout your career, whether you're a website coder, SEO expert, graphic artist, social media guru, CMO, or any other role. Today's guest is Dr. Jenn Mann, who's the famed Beverly Hills psychotherapist who's provided counsel to some of entertainment's biggest, to companies getting help with employees, to even couples just seeking therapy. A relationship expert, Dr. Jenn has hosted relationship shows on VH1 and SiriusXM Radio, as well as guests on Dr. Oz, Oprah, and many others. She's a former elite athlete, an author, and even a weekly feature in InStyle magazine. We'll talk about dealing with coworkers, creatives, millennials, elite athletes, type A's like me, and many more types in marketing or any other field. So let's listen to a shark get some couch time on this episode of A Shark's Perspective. Dr. Jenn, thank you for joining us on a Shark's Perspective. I know this is a little bit outside of your normal kind of podcast, talking deeply about marketing. But if you will, at least to start, tell me a little bit about your own career, if you will. I mean, you've had shows on VH1, Sirius XM Radio. You're cited weekly in InStyle and a lot of other major publications. You've been on Dr. Oz and Oprah, but I find your brand and your background really fascinating. Tell us a little bit about your background, please.
Well, thank you. My brand is me and I am my brand, so it makes it very easy to define my
Sure.
brand in a lot of ways. I am a licensed psychotherapist, and really kind of how my brand began was I was in, I guess you could say it was when I was in college, and I was a journalism major. I was planning to do print and television journalism. I did a story about rape on college campuses, about acquaintance rape. It was a topic that people weren't talking about very much at the time. And what happened was my story kind of exploded, and it became a much bigger story for newspapers in Boston. It ended up changing campus policy. 4 women had been raped on the campus, and the guy who had committed the crime, who was a student, would be getting out of prison, and no one knew what had happened because everything was very hush-hush at the school. And so what ended up happening is, as I was doing the story, people came out of the woodworks talking to me about their experiences and about having been sexually assaulted, having been raped. Teachers, students, all these people, all these women came forward to me, and I felt like I had to do something. I come from an activist kind of family, and so I volunteered for the Los Angeles Commission on Assaults Against Women as a rape and domestic violence counselor. And as soon as I started doing that, I knew I had found my calling. What ended up happening is, while I was in grad school, one of my teachers was doing an interview for Channel 2 Action News with Dr. Winnie King. And she said to me, I was very outspoken in class, and it was a class on eating disorders, and I'm someone who's recovered from an eating disorder. And she asked me and another student to come and speak and on TV. And I said, sure, that sounds like fun. And it hit me that instead of helping one person in my office, I could potentially help millions of people. And this was before there was Dr. Phil. It was before people did therapy on TV. But it really it enticed me, and it interested me, and it excited me, because there's so many taboos about therapy and about self-help and about depression and anxiety and eating disorders, and I felt like if I could bring that to the mainstream, that I could make a difference in the world. So it kind of grew from there, and I started doing television therapy and radio therapy and writing columns and books, and it exploded from there.
So, I know a lot of people are going to Google you that aren't familiar with you.
Sure.
But it makes sure to remind everybody, this is Dr. Jenn, the famed licensed psychotherapist, not the urologist named Dr. Jenn.
Well, that's actually Jennifer Berman.
Perfect.
And I at one point, the urologist is Jennifer Berman. And my name used to be Berman, but I went back to my maiden name, which is Mann. So if you're Googling me, check out 2 N's on Jenn, 2 N's on Mann.
Great. Well, how do you go from, you've written, gosh, you've written about diet, you've written about parenting, you've written about, you're written and spoken about rather, your work encompasses weight loss and eating disorders, being a parent,
Sure,
being, helping sports athletes, achieve that. You've
sure,
hit relationships, consulted with CEOs and groups and startups. I mean, how do you go from
sure.
all those type of different practices and sort of wrap it into one, you know, what you focus on the most?
Sure. Well, it's interesting. First of all, like I said, my brand is me and I am my brand. So all of these things are things that are of interest to me. And I am a former elite level athlete. I was on the USA Rhythmic Gymnastics national team for about 4 or 5 years. I discovered sports psychology when I was about probably 12 or 13, and my dad, who was very therapy savvy, started talking to me about sports psych, and I went and I got some books, and it made a huge difference in my performance. I went from one year not making the national team by .05, the following year barely making the national team in 12th place. It was only the top 12. And then I got into sports psych, and the following year I won 5 gold medals out of 5 at nationals. So that is something that goes back a long way, and I've done a lot of work with USA Gymnastics and a bunch of other different organizations and helped lots of athletes. So that's from my history, and I use a lot of that when I help CEOs, when I help executives, when I help business people, and also when I help performers. And I did my doctoral dissertation on eating disorders. As I mentioned, I'm someone who's recovered, and it's funny because when I first started doing television, and I finally went out and got some representation, my manager said to me, I was known for eating disorders, and she said, you're getting kind of pigeonholed as being an eating disorder specialist, and there's not that much work to do about eating disorders. And I said, well, look, my training is in everything. That's not the only thing I do. It's a percentage of my practice. And so she really helped me kind of get the word out that I do more than that. And it's funny because one time there's a show I was supposed to go on, and it was an eating disorder related show, and it was years later, and they said, well, we're looking for someone who only specializes in eating disorders. It's like, wow, I guess I did a really good job with my brand. People really know that I'm more than just eating disorders, but oops.
You can learn so much, at least in my profession of marketing. You can read a book on SEO, you can go to a webinar about paid search. There's in so many different ways you can learn from different places. What people always struggle with and will from now till the end of time is relationships. And so when I talk a little bit about relationships in the workplace, and I don't mean amorous, romantic type relationships.
Sure.
I'm talking about rather just the relationships that help people work together and function well in teams. And I know you've offered counsel on these kind of items, discussions. Tell me a little bit about what makes high performing teams work and how people should function in those kind of relationships.
Well, it's interesting. A lot of the skills, almost all of the skills that are helpful for a relationship are helpful in business. And learning how to disagree, learning how to negotiate, learning how to communicate clearly and respectfully, even when you are hot and passionate about a topic or about a project you are working on. These are key skills. And I think making people who you work with feel seen, heard, and understood, even if you don't necessarily agree with what it is they're talking about or what they're presenting. I think sometimes we get very adversarial too quickly. We end up alienating people who we need to be our allies.
That's such a good point because there's so many things that you can learn in a book that you can't learn with people. Yet
Yeah.
they can become the most important things to help you move ahead in your career and get promoted and move forward. I find it fascinating.
And
So
also when you're working on a group project or even when you're sitting and having a brainstorming session with other people in your company, that it's very easy to kind of pigeonhole people of like, oh, that's just the assistant. I don't have to listen to what he says. But everybody has something valuable to contribute, and people tend to be at their most creative when they are in an environment where they feel like I can throw out even crazy ideas, even dumb ideas, it doesn't matter, and that gets people's juices flowing, and companies end up being much more productive when they create that atmosphere.
Yeah, even if you're an entrepreneur, no man or woman is an island. You got to learn how to
Yep.
function in teams. So I'm going to go back to something that you just said about the story you wrote about in college, and I know it's a little bit of a different translation, but obviously
Hmm.
Me Too has consumed
Yeah.
it's consumed the public. What kind of
Yeah.
counsel do you give to either people that are um, one victims,
Mhm.
people people at work environments? How do you help counsel people that are going through these kind of environments right now?
Well, you bring up a great point, and when I did that story and people started coming out of the woodworks, it was a very Me Too type of experience because all of these women were coming to me and saying, "This happened to me, this happened to me," and it was this kind of collective experience, and it happened to be all women, even though I know that it happens to men as well, and I've seen men in my practice who things have happened to like that. My advice, first of all, is to always know what the company policy is about sexual harassment, about acceptable behavior, unacceptable behavior, dating in the workplace, all that sort of stuff, because information is our first line of defense. And then the second thing is to make sure to document anything that happens to you and speak to the appropriate people so that there is a paper trail. And also sometimes, especially when these kind of things start off as kind of lower level incidents, you can sometimes nip it in the bud. And I'm not talking about someone who obviously is being assaulted, but sometimes there are people in the workplace, especially older men, who just don't understand appropriate boundaries. And understand, I'm not excusing that behavior. I would never do that. But what I am saying is that sometimes education is the key to prevention. And I think also the other thing that I talk about a lot is looking at this is a spectrum of behaviors. And, there's a big difference between the guy who calls his secretary, and I put that in quotes as opposed to assistant, honey or sweetie, which is inappropriate and not okay in the workplace, versus a Harvey Weinstein who has allegedly raped women, and that there's a spectrum of bad behavior, and there's kind of a certain line when it comes to assault and that kind of thing. And understand, I'm not minimizing anything because it's all inappropriate, it's all unacceptable. But I think that there's an important discussion to be had along the way, especially once you get to a certain point. And after that, it's the police, it's reporting, it's making sure that that person feels safe to report. And it's very scary and very traumatic for people who are going through this with powerful people to report.
Yeah, and I was just thinking as you were talking about it being this happened when you were in college, isn't
Yeah.
amazing. That was social media is not that old when you collectively think about it, but think if your story had come out, when Facebook was in its prime, how much
Oh
even
yeah. I
I
mean
mean,
it.
we're kind of on the forefront of this.
100%. I mean, I kind of wish it had existed then, But when I did this story, the Boston Globe picked it up. I got a call from the Boston Globe saying, "We heard about this story you're doing. We want to talk to you."
So let's go over to a little more of the workplace and more so by nature of
Mhm.
the professions. There are
Mhm.
a lot of creatives who work in marketing, maybe more so than most industries. I mean, you can be creative in
Mhm.
in anything you do, but people that are working with Photoshop or coding in HTML to make a web page, or
Mhm.
sending out email acquisition lists,
Sure.
um,
Graphic
graphic
design,
design, any of those are generally tend to be a little more,
advertising.
in advertising and marketing tend to be a little more creative. So, talk about the
Absolutely.
differences of working with those types of people. I mean, what are the best ways of dealing with those types of personalities? And I'm basically talking about divas like me, who who are going to
Well,
be a little
look,
stronger willed than a lot of people just based on the
look,
profession.
I grew up in a creative home. My parents are songwriters. They're the show Beautiful is based on their life, Barry Mann and Cynthia Weil, with Carole King and Jerry Goffin. And so, my parents were kind of my fertile ground for learning about the creative mind as I grew up. And I do a lot of work with creatives in my practice, especially entertainment industry. And in my experience, most people who are creative tend to be, they think outside the box. They tend to have trouble with boundaries and rules. They tend to just be a little bit different and more emotional and more in touch with that part of themselves and can be a little more sensitive. And I think that it's important that employers, in order to get the best performance out of those people, to understand how they're wired. And I'm not saying like, oh, you treat person A, these rules apply to this person but not to this person, but I do think that you want to create an atmosphere where someone like that can thrive. And sometimes it does mean that maybe the rules that work really well for the business side, the number side, don't necessarily bring out the best in the creative, and making sure that you provide an environment where they can really explore their ideas and feel free to get through and communicate all of their ideas. Some of them may seem kind of wacky, but that's how you get to a place where you have the home run ideas.
Couldn't agree more. And more of I think about it, hey, that pretty much describes me and every person I've worked with in the last 10 years.
Yeah.
And trying to collectively get people to perform together. I mean, every company, if you're a technology, you got a widget maker, maybe that widget does something a little bit slightly different, but a lot of times it's not just the widget itself, it's how those teams work together to really propel to success. Let's switch the gears a little bit and talk a little bit
Sure.
about millennials. So those dreaded millennials that have gotten labeled incorrectly as some sort of alien race, which they're not. Um,
Yeah.
However, they are a bit different. Their culture and
Yeah.
how they were brought up was different. I mean, same as any
Mhm.
other generation, right? But I think this generation in particular, especially
Mhm.
because of social media,
Mhm.
has changed the way that group interacts in the relationships they have with each other. Talk a little bit about how you've seen people deal with millennials, because it is a challenge in advertising, it is a challenge for hiring people, it is a challenge for
Mhm.
once people get on the job and working together with whether it's baby boomers and millennials or any other type of group.
Sure. And look, the most common complaint I hear from my clients who are employing millennials, whether it's accurate or not, but I hear it a lot, is kind of people not being willing to pay their dues and kind of feeling entitled to be further up the ladder than they are, and they haven't put in the time. And I think that it's particularly important with millennials to be extremely clear on what the expectations of the jobs are, what the parameters are, what the trajectory is, what it takes to get there, so that you can kind of keep people goal setting and on track, so that that kind of stuff doesn't come up.
Yeah, and I think a lot of times they get unfortunately labeled with one of the most creative labels in the world. I mean, millennial, it's one that sticks. Gen X, for example, is not a fun thing to say, or Gen Y. It's not as catchy
Sure.
as millennials. And but so when you think about social media in particular, and the world that kind of drives a lot of that age group, what
And they are typically, they are so intuitive around not just social media, but just all kinds of media, and they bring such a fresh perspective to the business place that they're really valuable employees, especially if you know how to work with that generation.
Oh, 100%. I think half the time my biggest challenge is just not trying to sound like the old guy yelling at kids to get out of his yard. But absolutely,
Sure.
they bring an amazing fresh perspective. I mean, you learn something from a different group, regardless of who it is. But
Yeah.
so when you think about social media and social proofing, why do you think it affects people so much today in their, I'm going to kind of label this as purchasing and decision choices? I mean, I find it remarkable that an anonymous source who you don't necessarily even know is real, or anybody you've had any interaction with whatsoever can post reviews, for example, on
Sure.
sites everywhere, and that can help you make your decisioning process more than somebody who you may see walk down the hall but you don't go interact with. If you see a
Mhm.
a 5-star review or a 1-star review from somebody thousands of miles away, that tends to lend itself more in that sort of social space, if you will. But why does that have such an impact?
Um, Look, I think that the pros and the cons are kind of they're the fact that someone is doing a review anonymously. On one hand, it's horrible, especially when it's your company and someone gets to hide behind anonymity. On the other hand, people can also talk about products they might not publicly be willing to talk about. Like who wants to do a review of a sex toy if your boss is going to Google you and see it? But if you know you're going to be anonymous, you may speak more truthfully. So I think that when we look at these kind of review sites, I think we have to kind of look at what the patterns are. If someone consistently has reviews that show that they have similar taste, similar ideas, similar preferences, then that can be incredibly valuable. On the flip side, people can also do a lot of damage to companies behind that behind that anonymity.
So let's switch gears then and talk a little bit about work-life balance, because something common that runs through every thread is just the people spending so much time at work anymore, spending not enough time with family, friends, whoever, but to move up in their careers. What kind of
Yeah.
advice do you give to people to deal with that kind of work-life balance?
Well, a few things. I think that women have it particularly difficult once we have kids. I think the mommy guilt that we feel, and I can speak personally and professionally on this as a mom and a businesswoman, but I think that everybody struggles with it in this day and age, and I think that one of the biggest problems I see in families, in couples in particular, is that the relationship tends to come last. That we are at work, that our bosses can reach us around the clock. If we are the boss, our customers and our employees can reach us around the clock on our cell phones typically. That there is kind of a instant gratification that is expected in this culture of like, hey, I need this paper, in a few hours. I need this report. Please get this done. Please ship that thing. And so there's so much access to us and so little boundaries that protecting that time with our family is crucial. And I always say with couples that couples should have a minimum of 20 minutes. I prefer 30 minutes, but a minimum of 20 minutes of face-to-face time that is no screen time. It's not looking at your phone, not looking at your iPad, not watching TV, watching a show together. Yeah, that's fun, but that's not connecting. And connection is really the key to healthy relationships.
So that is exactly why it's titled A Shark's Perspective, and why my nickname is Shark, is because I can turn off my phone and get away from the world. And once I get into the water and literally dive with sharks, until
Hmm.
iPhone and everybody screwed it up by making phones that you could get wet.
Yeah.
But it's the one place that I know in general that I can't get a phone call
Sure.
or an email, and I just need to get away.
Yeah.
And if I could do it, I do it every day. But so let's switch then back to something you referenced earlier. You've got a healthy practice as well in sports psychology and helping elite athletes now reach their potential. How do you go about doing that as opposed to people that you counsel that come in that talk about their marriage or sexual or family problems? What are the type of buttons that you're generally kind of pushing and working with?
Well, for the most part, sports psychology is very cognitive behavioral. It's much more about giving people exercises to do, teaching them about imagery, teaching them about positive self talk, about affirmations, about visualization, about very specific tools. Sometimes I'll get an athlete in my office where something from their childhood or something that's happened in their personal life is really impacting their performance, and in those cases I need to really get into it. But the bulk of the sports psych that I do is very cognitive behavioral.
So for type A's like me, we're still competing over everything. It's, who can be the first to work in the morning, or, eat the bowl of
Sure.
cereal the quickest. How does the elite athletes, what are the commonalities you've seen between them and in people that are not elite athletes, but in the workplace that succeed? What kind of commonalities do you see as far as those triggers in their brain that are making them
I
self-perform?
I would say drive is probably number one, and I would say ability to tolerate failure is number two.
Well, at least I got one of those.
Yeah. But we all have to fail a lot of times in order to have success,
Agreed.
and we have to see it not as a failure, but as a learning experience, and that ability makes a huge difference, and also enjoyment of the hunt, not just the kill.
Great point. So I know that you've provided a lot of additional advice and counsel and support to CEOs, and I believe especially with startups. When you're giving counsel to companies, whatever
Hmm.
the title of the person, what kind of advice do you give them on the types of people and personalities to hire and types of high performing relationships and teams?
Well, first of all, the number one most important thing when you're hiring someone is that you're aware of your own issues. Because sometimes you
Such a
can
good
have
point.
someone that would be a great employee, but she looks like your mother and you haven't worked through your issues with your mother, or her voice sounds like your mother, so she's going to annoy the crap out of you because you haven't worked through your issues with your mother. So really that's the first thing, to know kind of what unresolved issues you have, to know what you need to work on, and to have the awareness, because awareness is the first step. If you go, okay, wow, this woman really reminds me of my mother, and I haven't worked through my issues with my mother, but she'd be a great employee, I'm going to have to really monitor myself when I work with her because I might be more easily triggered. You're going to have a very different experience. So I would say that's the first one. I think the second one is also to know exactly what it is you're looking for in filling a position. What kind of personality are you looking for? What about the other people who work with that person? How are they going to mesh with other employees that they may need to collaborate with? Do they understand the company policy and philosophy? Because if they don't understand the philosophy, they're going to be disappointed. They're going to be surprised. There are some companies that expect you to be available around the clock. And for some people, that's going to piss them off. For other people, that's like a dream come true. Great, I can reach my boss at 11 o'clock at night and do some work. Awesome, that's great. So really making it very clear what the philosophy is and the expectations.
Yeah, it's such a great point because you so often, and I use a funny example about trying to get those issues with somebody's mother, but when you look at just trying to hire the right types of people, you don't necessarily think about your personal psychology behind it at all. It's always here's a job description, trying to
Yeah.
find somebody that will come on board, but you don't think about the behind the scenes issues in your own head about what you project into what you expect from what
Absolutely.
employees
And
can look
I
like.
recommend that everyone have 1 year of weekly individual therapy, and I recommend that couples do a good 6 months of weekly therapy, because I think that the experience of getting to know yourself in a different way with a trained professional is so unique and can help in business so much that, to me, you're at a disadvantage if you haven't done therapy.
I agree completely, and I just want to thank you for this half hour of my own therapy.
My
I think
pleasure.
anybody that works with me knows I need much more. But can you tell us a little bit about where people can find Dr. Jen on all the channels and where you're
Absolutely.
coming up?
The best thing to do is to follow me on social media, and I'm on Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, and Snapchat at Dr. Jenman, DrJennMann, and my website is Dr. Jen, spelled out DoctorJenn.com. And because I always announce all my appearances and where I am, and also check out my weekly column in InStyle magazine called Hump Day with Dr. Jen that comes out, of course, every Wednesday.
Great. Thank you again so much for your time, Dr. Jen.
My pleasure. Thank you.
So there was my conversation / therapy session with Dr. Jen regarding relationships in the workplace. 3 key takeaways from the conversation that you can apply were the following. First, Learning and developing relationship skills are often the most helpful for businesses. The soft skills can become so important. Connection is really the key to healthy relationships. Second, people tend to be their most creative when they're in an environment that fosters that. Companies end up being much more productive when they create that type of atmosphere. Third, when hiring, not only does it matter what someone's skills and personality are, but it's also important how you are projecting an idea of what you think someone should be. What are the issues that you have internally that form those expectations? Getting to know yourself can help in business and in hiring. So, whatever skills you're working on improving in your marketing profession, consider how you develop the skills in your relationships with people you work with on teams. Got a question? Send me an email to kenneth@asharksperspective.com. Thank you for taking the time to listen to our conversation regarding another one of the many components that makes up marketing today, and join us on the next episode of A Shark's Perspective.